I saw this sign and it said Department of Energy and Climate Change, and I was standing amongst investors, strikers, environmentalists, and I couldn't believe what was happening about the closure of that wind turbine factory. Especially right now, we've got a huge economic crisis. There's a campaign about 1 million climate jobs. I couldn't believe I was standing outside looking at the Department of Climate Change with people making turbines who were losing their jobs. You know, the jobs that the wind turbines going to be exported from Germany or America, I can't remember, etc. And, you know, I don't feel reassured about us meeting Kyoto agreements. I feel terrified of the scenario that Jonathan has so aptly described. I know we're not there, but it's there in the world, and we're on the world. So it is here. And I just can't believe I just couldn't believe that that was happening. And, you know, I'm not here to score points about whether it's Labour or Tory or Lib Dem or whatever, but I was just aghast about that, and I wanted to share that with the platform in the meeting.
I certainly agree with you. I think what we had there was actually the consequences of a much more long-term failure. Because actually in the early days of wind turbines, Britain was actually in the vanguard of developing that technology along with Denmark. And what happened was there was an absolute failure of nerve, and there was a failure to invest to ensure that the technology went from effectively a demonstrator phase through to full commercial implementation phase. And as a result of that, we lost the lead in that technology. Denmark very happily saw us, just allow them to get way, way ahead, to the point where now obviously they are the primary manufacturer of wind turbines. They developed the technology in a way that we haven't. And I think I hope that we will learn lessons from that. I was up at EMEC a couple of weeks ago, which is the European Marine Energy Centre up in Orkney. And there we absolutely have world-leading capacity for installing demonstrator projects, but we're at that same sort of critical phase. And the real question now is whether the government will put in funding to help those technologies to get more demonstrator sites, to get more capacity to do wind and tidal and wave technology through to that full commercial implementation. And it's tragic when you see us developing technologies and then not getting them to not taking advantage of them in the green jobs and growth that could be coming on the back of them. And it was, as you say, crazy that the factory in the Isle of Wight had to.
Okay. I'm going to take a few contributions and then I'll get the speakers back to answer the questions. Ken, you indicated. Sarah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm Ken. I'm Secretary of Brent Campaign Against Climate Change. I'm also a member of the trade union group of the Campaign Against Climate Change. And what I'm most going to speak about is the campaign initiated by the trade union group of Campaign Against Climate Change and supported by a number of national unions now for 1 million climate jobs. Can I just, before I do that, can I just pick up on both speakers raised the issue of population growth and the long or medium-term problem of population growth placing pressure on the planning resources, etc. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of research coming out now, and I'm thinking particularly of that book, People Quake, and there's another book I was emailed about a couple of days ago, which shows that in most parts of the world, not parts of Africa, not parts of the Middle East, and women get control over their fertility, populations are going down. And it is very likely that within a generation or so...
So they're not going down. The rate of increase is declining.
Fertility is falling off.
Yeah.
No?
Fertility is reducing, but also mortality is reducing as well.
It is. But
for every extra year education that a woman gets, a young girl gets in those countries, particularly in Asia, for every extra year, I think it's that she has one less child for every extra year in education.
Absolutely.
Now that is staggering.
Yeah.
And so you're absolutely right. It's by directing that sort of aid and resource in there that we're going to get control over climate change, population growth. But of course, it's a long-term project.
It's long-term. The commentators have suggested that within 2 generations, population won't be reaching replacement levels. The long-term problem is not going to be population growth, but supporting an elderly population. I mean, I would rather say the issue is consumption rather than population. And I agree with Jonathan. We've got to ultimately have a society which has quite different values. And we have a system which is not entirely based on growth all the time. At the moment we're placed with the alternatives by all the political parties, austerity or growth. And there's a matter of arithmetic that we live on a finite planet and we've got to find a way of living which doesn't depend on economic expansion all the time. But look, I want to go back to the campaign for 1 million climate jobs. And I got a message this morning, email this morning, from one of the people who's involved in the South African climate justice movement, and also with the main confederation of South African trade unions, which is now campaigning for 1 million climate jobs. And he'll be speaking at both the conferences that are happening on Saturday on climate justice. And that's really had the site. And now he's quite a well-known documentary filmmaker and environmental campaigner in South Africa. And he sends a message of greeting, and he goes on to say, I'll quote him a little bit at length, because it really does put things in context. As things presently stand, whole chunks of the planet will be set to become wastelands, nowhere more so than in Africa, which is set to burn like at no other time in living history. On our continent, we have massive regions reeling from global warming as hundreds of millions of subsistence farmers and fishermen are teetering on the edge. Famine is again ravaging Somalia, which created a staggering 3.5 million climate refugees. The drought in the Sahel region over the past 5 decades, according to climate scientists, has been fed by global warming. Now, we faced a fairly imminent environmental catastrophe, possibly the greatest challenge in the history of the human race. I don't think the politicians, the pundits, the economists, and all the experts have got their imaginations around us at the moment. How often do you hear climate change mentioned on the TV? When are we going to see fewer car ads, for example? We face a massive environmental crisis, and I think we all know we face a massive economic crisis. We've got officially nearly 1 million young people. I'm going to go on a bit longer, I'm afraid, Carol. Officially 1 million young people, sorry Chair, been very, very out of order, unemployed. Now, the push for 1 million climate jobs is an attempt to start tackling both those problems. And we're talking about government jobs. We're talking about investment in research and development, investment in funding for home insulation. We're talking about massive expansion of public transport, especially trains, cheap public transports to get cars off the roads. And this is about the government actually doing it. Because certainly the Conservatives have lost all credibility in terms of becoming the Green Party ever. And we're seeing George Osborne saying we're not going to do anything for the environment if it affects the economy, if it affects the profits of companies. I mean, that must be one of the most barbaric things ever said. Because if you don't have a viable planet, you don't have a viable economy. But we're also talking about millions of people facing misery and, in the long term, death. We have to tackle both problems, and it can't be left to private investment, private companies. It just won't happen fast enough. I mean, can you imagine in 1939 mobilising for war and the government says, OK, we're going to leave this to private industry? I mean, we're talking about something much more serious than the Second World War. And it has to be about governments that do it. It has to be tackled directly. But also, if we leave the private industry, it is going to be much slower and much more expensive. We see the power companies, they're not going to invest in the power lines that are needed for renewables unless they can guarantee billions of pounds of profit. So I'm urging people in the audience to support the campaign for 1 million state climate jobs. I'd like Barry's comments. Sorry I went off.
Okay, now I'm going to take all the people who want to have their say and then come back to the two speakers. Sarah?
Right, I want to make a few probably unrelated points, but just the things that seem to me really important. I was really glad that Barry ended on the word injustice, because I think that the longer people are complacent, as George Osborne has been complacent about climate change, the greater the injustice that grows in the world. There are things like the growing speculation in food, which is, you know, you just wonder how these hedge funds can speculate in order to raise the price of food, knowing that as they do it, they are sentencing people to death. I mean, it sounds melodramatic. It isn't, it's true. The same thing is happening with, you talked about the way that devastation will come to parts of Europe. So there are European and American companies buying up fertile land in Africa, ready to have it ready when it's needed to meet consumption. Consumption very often of absolutely unnecessary luxury goods. I mean, I don't think that it's particularly useful for people to beat themselves up and say, I must live on beans and toast for the rest of my life because of climate change. I think we need a very much more informed discussion and a more informed understanding of the fact that it is this push to make profits out of things and the injustice of it. And the fact that people talk about natural disasters, but very few disasters are actually natural. And even when they are, their effects will be incredibly different according to the, you know, you can have an earthquake in California, maybe 4 people die, and an earthquake on the same scale in Turkey with thousands of casualties because of the houses that are being cheaply built and all this kind of thing. When my daughter did her master's in California, there were areas of desert where there were sprinklers on the lawns because they were getting the water out of it. I think that's what's made her a geographer with a great interest in justice. I wanted to say a little bit, 2 more things. One is population. I agree with what Ken was saying. I think it is very, very dangerous to do what people have been doing and to say, on present trends, if you studied statistics, you know that's, you know, the chances of present trends, the situation that's existing at the present time, the relationships between people, the economic situation that people are in, remaining unchanged over the next 50 years, minimal. When Malthus said that population was exploding and people would be driven to starvation, there were 6 million people in this country. And in the time since he said it, was it 1801? Pretty much.
Several editions.
Yeah, there were several editions, okay. And 1806, I think, is the one that I've read. And since then, the world hasn't collapsed in total starvation, although there is, you know, let's face it, there is starvation in very large parts of the world. I want to come back a bit nearer home because I absolutely think that the call for 1 million climate jobs is a very valid one. I spent 30 years as a teacher in Brent. I taught little children who are now grown up, who've done brilliantly, facing unemployment. I've got a granddaughter hoping to go to university next year. The thought of the mountain of debt that she'll be carrying with her, whether she'll get a job, all these things. So there's another form of injustice, and the broken promises of this government when they abandon what slightly inadequate green promises they made just, sorry, makes my blood boil and my blood pressure go up. And I'm sorry that's all a bit rambling, but I think there is a thread that runs through about justice and about, I have to say that I'm not convinced that capitalism can actually solve, you know, the problem of climate change can be solved under capitalism, because the drive of capitalism is the accumulation of profit, and the drive for climate change needs a completely different outlook on the world, and it is that production should be for need and for the needs of the people of the world. And I believe that if that were the motivation, you could actually achieve the goals that are needed to be achieved.
Thank you. Gentleman at the back, I don't know your name. No, you, yeah.
What I found it excellent talk, John, the thing is, I want to say that I find it extremely disturbing and extremely frightening the way the population is rising. And therefore it has to be emphasised so much to everyone to go round to schools and talk about it. And also to go to vicars and rabbis and mention it. No one is immune. Certainly, I'd have no objection to someone going to my synagogue and speaking about it. If John from Essex wants to do that, go ahead, do it. And Barry Gardner, he's been to my synagogue, I believe.
I would like to accuse the political class of a total dereliction of their moral duties in face of what we know about climate change. I think that they have allowed climate change to slip off the front pages of our newspapers and American newspapers, but I can't call Barry to account on that one, for several years now. And one of the first pieces of evidence that I can offer the politicians around this table is the very few people who have turned up today. Clearly, as far as the general British public is concerned, climate change has gone under the radar. This is particularly striking, as the facts are presented, by the fact that Harrow has one of the highest Asian communities in the country. And yet, if you look at who's getting the downside of climate change, which unarguably is happening, the world's temperature is going up, the CO2 emissions are going up. They went up the last couple of years despite the world recession faster than ever before. The ice caps are melting, the forests are disappearing, the phytoplankton in the oceans are being knocked off by carbon dioxide acidification in the oceans. And of the people who have been affected by serious environmental, in brackets, occurrences, 2.7 billion of them were in Asia. Just to give you some facts, earthquakes were responsible for 76 million people being very badly affected. In terms of windstorms, 360 million. In terms of droughts, 747 million. And in those who've suffered under the effect of flooding, over 1 billion. 2.3 billion people in Asia, over the total world numbers of 2.7 being affected, were in Asia. In the Western world, 1% of that figure can be laid at the Western doors. Do the politicians draw any inferences from that in public and say what might be done? I haven't heard them.
Thank you very much. Any more? Because I've got a little thing on my list, Ken spots. Now Ken has said something. Do you still want to take advantage of your little Ken spot?
Didn't intend to speak on it. This is quite different. First of all, I'd like to thank somebody else for coming along. Can we have the answer?
Oh, no, this is just before the answer. We had the little Ken spot.
Yeah.
On my
I mean,
agenda.
just a kind of little rally thing, really. Thank the speakers for coming along. I'm sorry we haven't had a bigger audience. This is our first venture into Wembley, so we're breaking new ground. However, there is a video being made, and the videos go out on several blogs, and we get correspondence from literally people around the world as a result of these blogs. So after the last meeting, we had an email from somebody in Australia. So we're probably going to pick up a much bigger audience in e-terms than in physical terms. For people who don't know about Brain Campaigning Against Climate Change, we are a network of environmental activist groups, trade unions, political organisations, tenants and residents associations, religious groups, churches, and we hope mosques. We hold meetings every couple of months. If you can leave your details before you go out, please do. We will let you know about future activities. We have got a meeting coming up in December, and we hope that you will join us on the Climate Justice March on December the 3rd.
Thank you, Ken. And now answer the questions. I'm going to do this in reverse order. Barry.
Thanks very much. Look, I've written down a number of things here under various headings. Let me try and synthesize what I thought were the key points. You spoke of the push to make profits, and it's really quite extraordinary that the model of growth that we have is one that is dependent on classical economics and looking at GDP. And the extraordinary thing is that it's quite possible for a country to expand its GDP but become poorer. And this is what classical economics has not taken on board up until fairly recently. And let me give you an example of how that can come about. If you are an African country, let's say in Middle Africa, I will pick up a particular one, and you allow a timber concession where somebody comes in and chops down a tract of the Congo Basin rainforest. They then decide that they don't want to fabricate timber out of those logs, but they'll simply export them from the country direct, perhaps into a neighbouring country where they've got a production unit, and they then turn it into timber in that neighbouring country, export it over to the European Union, perhaps as tables and chairs. What's gone on here is very significant, because the country that had that forest in the first place has seen an increase in its GDP. It has got the price of the logs that had been exported. But a World Bank study a few years ago showed very clearly that the price that you get for the logs, and indeed the value of the alternate land use, if you then put that to agricultural use, is no more than 30% of the total value of that forest to the country as a whole. And the reason for that is very simple. The true value of the forest lies in the ecosystem services which those trees provide. It lies in the watershed protection, it resides in the climate regulation, the water regulation, the flood alleviation, the soil stabilization, all of these services. But of course those services do not simply benefit the owner of that tract of land. And therefore they're not taken into account when that owner of that tract of land decides what to do with the land. They're actually benefits that accrue to the wider population. And that's why one of the most important things that I've been working on has been to incorporate the valuation of natural capital into the frameworks that government use to calculate their economies and to calculate their national wealth. And a super example of this is, and I think, Jonathan, maybe you mentioned Hurricane Katrina briefly, and you mentioned natural disasters, is of course with Katrina. Because what happened in New Orleans was, and I think you very accurately said, people call them natural disasters, but they're not natural disasters, usually they're man-made, and that was exactly what Katrina was. In fact, back in the 1950s, a decision had been taken to cut a canal, through the lower part of the Mississippi River Delta. It's called the Mr. Go, colloquially in the local area, because it's MRGO, Mississippi River Gulf Outlet. And it's a straight channel of about 40 miles. Now, what happened as a result of that was the increased solidification of that area began to destroy the Tupelo Swamp. There was an initial destruction of it as they cut the channel, but they then destroyed the Tupelo Swamp. Now, Tupelo Swamp forest actually reduces the surge swell during an event, a swell event, by 6 feet for every 1 kilometre width of swamp. And if you look at what the US Army Engineering Corps have been doing over the past few years since Katrina in 2005, they have been building a ring of steel around New Orleans, recreating the system of levees that were there. And that ring of steel is costing $16 billion. $16 billion. But they came out with a very interesting finding. They actually published it, and they were honest enough at least to do that. And that was what they said was, every levee which had been protected by Tupelo Swamp had remained intact. Every levee that had not been protected by Tupelo Swamp was breached. And the real cost of the destruction of that swampland is actually the $16 billion that is being spent now in recreating the ring of steel around the city, and of course the $125 billion that it's calculated were lost as a result of Katrina, and the lives that were lost as a result of Katrina. So, understanding the value of natural capital is absolutely critical, whether you're in the Congo rainforest or whether you're in the wealthiest country that the world has ever known. I'll stop there. There's lots more things that I've written down here that I'd like to address, but in respect, Chair, I'll stop there.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I might just add a few more comments. Certainly when I was working in Bangladesh, there was an incident out there as well on Boxing Day, and pretty much all of the coastline in Sri Lanka, which had been developed for hotels, was affected, and that which was protected by mangrove was pretty much protected. I was just going to mention one thing about where food and fuel fit together. Biofuels at the moment don't seem to be used as a mechanism to replace fossil fuels, but more to supplement it. The supply meets demand. We're getting peak everything. We've got peak oil, we've got peak food, as we've talked about. There's peak resource use, peak minerals, like I can't remember the name, I think it's coltan that goes in your mobile phones that's caused wars in the Congo. So we're treating food and fuel as a clash as we try and top up everything, as we're peaking everything. And I think it's really dangerous to take out population as any kind of separate issue. I think it's better to focus, as Richard Heinberg has done in his book, Peak Everything, in seeing how everything is related. And simply as everything is going up, population is tending to go up at the same time. That suits consumers.